Hi there. I'm Patricia Polacco. I write and illustrate children's picture books. And you'll notice I'm washing my hands just as you have been instructed to do. I know all of you kids are staying home because probably your schools are closed. It's the same for me. Every adult I know is staying home from work even. They're not going to work. They can't. And why they're doing this, in case you don't know, is they're worried about this tiny microbe, a tiny little germ called the COVID-19, or it's called the coronavirus. It's not going to kill you, don't worry. But for very old people, it has made them very, very sick. So they're asking us to stay away from public places and not be near each other to try to stop this from spreading. Washing your hands is the best defense you have. You can certainly use this stuff, and I do. I spray it everywhere. See, even though I've washed my hands, I'll use it again because I'm, very, very conscious of this. And I wipe down surfaces in my house with this stuff. I also am living on this stuff. Now, this was invented by a teacher. And I use the gummies because they're easy for me to get down. I just put it in my mouth, chew it up, and it disappears pretty quickly. But what it does is gives you a huge amount of vitamin C because if you're fending off the flu or any kind of illness, vitamin C is apparently a natural substance that you can get in oranges, pears, apples, to help safeguard your body against infection. So I eat one of these, I want to say every couple of hours, just to make sure. Because I'm 75 years old. I'm not young. And I have coronary artery disease. I've had open heart surgery. I'm also diabetic. Type 2, but still serious enough that the country is very worried about people my age catching this virus. So my beautiful, beautiful assistant, Penny Brown, who's taping this, is 6 feet away from me. When she came, instead of hugging and kissing like we always do, and going and having lunch, which we can't do either because the restaurants are closed, we're staying a distance apart, which this is recommended, and she's filming me reading some of my books. Now, the book I want to tell you about is almost exactly what we're going through now. This book is called The Trees of the Dancing Goats. And this is an account of when a huge epidemic came through this county, would have to be 70 years ago, of scarlet fever. Now, scarlet fever isn't deadly, but it can make you very, very sick. An old person, yes, it can make them sick enough to pass away. But this is a story of what my family did, because I lived through that epidemic and I'm still here. Now, at that time, we didn't have the medicines and the safeguards they do now. Even if a family member of yours ends up in the hospital, they're going to be fine because they have so many wonderful medicines now. They'll be home with you soon. Please don't worry. There's nothing to be worried about. But what they're asking you to do is stay apart from other people to make sure that you don't spread the virus. Apparently the virus, for me talking to you or coughing, the droplets leave my mouth and they'll come sit on you and that'll make you sick. So this is why they're asking us to stay in. They would have asked the same thing at this time, except we didn't know how disease was spread at that time. So it's called Trees of the Dancing Goats. And to give you the background, my parents were divorced when I was very young. My mother moved back in with her parents, who are the two people in this story with my mother. My father moved back in with his parents in Williamston, Michigan. In both households, because they shared custody, we had the summer with my dad, the school year with my mother. So in both households, I was around amazing grandparents. Both households, my grandfather on my mother's side was an artist. My grandmother on my father's side was an artist. They always had an easel up. They always had an art table full of art supplies. So I believe that is why I became an artist. I'm convinced of that. But I want to share this story with you because it's, interestingly, a little close to kind of what we're going through now. This was during the Christmas time. This was during the celebration of Christmas. And my mother's family, they were Jewish. So they celebrated Hanukkah. They didn't celebrate Christmas, but all of our neighbors were Christian and they celebrated Christmas. This was our little house in Union City. Now I live in Union City in a great big old house. It used to be an inn. This little farm, about 5 miles from me. But it's still there, absolutely still there. And this is kind of the, I guess, half-titled page. And my grandpa and my brother and I are going into the house and greeting my grandmother. My mother was a teacher in Battle Creek, and she lived in the same house. And I'm going to begin. At our farm, just outside Union City, Michigan, we didn't celebrate the same holidays as most of our neighbors, but we shared their delight and anticipation of their holidays just the same. There's my grandma, my grandpa, my brother, and I. Rotten Richie, in case you're wondering. Such a cold the winter brings, my grandmother, my babushka, said as she looked out our front window. My bones it makes to ache. She slapped her chest. Then she caught my eye and winked. She wasn't fooling me. I knew how much she loved the snow. It reminded her of her homeland in the Ukraine. Carly, again you complain, but still you watch the snow with such light in your eyes, Grandpa said as he threw her a kiss. My grandfather was from Soviet Georgia, way to the south of Russia. He and Babushka spoke Russian and had wonderful accents. They kept their homelands in their hearts, even though they had never been permitted to return. Just then, Mama rolled into the long driveway. She'd been teaching in Battle Creek, Fremont Elementary. Just then, Mama was home. Mama's home, Mama's home, my brother Richard called as we watched her get out of the car. Mama drove way over to Battle Creek every day to teach school. Now she would be off for the next 2 weeks because of the holiday season. I loved having her home for the winter vacation. This year we would have a week together to prepare the 8 days of the Hanukkah festival. The next day, Mama took our old tarnished menorah and washed it and then gave it to me to polish. When I rubbed, I watched my grandmother make the candles that we would put in it. Babushka tied long strings to a metal rod and dipped them into a pot of melted beeswax. Then she kept on the stove. Then she hung the wax-covered strings on the wall to dry before dipping them again to add another layer of wax. She did this over and over again until the candles were thick and sumptuous. She hummed as she dipped, never seeming to tire of the long process. Grandpa prepared for our Festival of Lights as well. He carved small toys out of wood. Richard and I weren't supposed to know what he was making for us, but we would peek in his workroom and we'd spy on him. But he did every year, and that afternoon when we went to town, we couldn't help sneaking into his workroom to take a peek. Look, a dancing goat, my brother exclaimed as he held one up. I like this one, I said, cradling a little dog in my palm. Grandpa had painted the animals with colors from his homeland. He marveled at how magical they all were. Do you think he made enough for all 8 days of Hanukkah? Richard asked as he eyed the arrays of wooden toys. Well, you know he has, I whispered. I took one lasting look, knowing that soon Grandpa would wrap them all in color paper. My mother called for me, and I thought she had caught us spying, but she only wanted me to go over to the Criminalists for some cornmeal. The Criminalists, our nearest neighbors, lived about half a mile down the road. They were farmers like us, and at harvest time, Mr. Crimmel always helped Grandpa. All the neighbors helped each other that way. Friendship means something, my grandpa always said. especially for those who till the soil. I practically lived at the Criminals' house because Cherry Criminal was my very best friend. We especially loved the holiday season when I'd watch her family decorate their Christmas tree, and she'd watch my family light the menorah. I knew as we were bustling in anticipation of the Festival of Lights at our house, the Criminals would be preparing for the arrival of Christmas at theirs. But when I got there, I found everybody was quite sick, even Cherry, who was usually full of spizzerincto, as my babushka would say. She seemed quiet and weak. She was crying. "I hope Santa will remember we live here," she wailed. "Well, why wouldn't he?" I asked. "Because we haven't put up a tree this year or even decorated. Papa's too sick to get out of bed. So is my mama. We're all so sick. Santa won't come." I ran home and burst into our house with the news about Cherry and her family. Mama seemed very worried. "Did you go inside their house, Tricia?" she asked me. "Well, sure," I answered. "Uh-oh," my brother said. Then they all looked at each other. "When your grandfather was in town today," Babushka said very slowly, "Dr. Leach told him how many families around here have come down with scarlet fever. The Criminals must have it, and I sent you there," my mother said as she rushed me into the bathroom. She pulled off my clothes and soundly scrubbed every inch of me. "Am I going to get it, Mama?" I asked. "It's very contagious," she answered. "We'll know in a few days." "Am I going to die?" I asked, starting to cry. "No, baby," Mama said as she held me close. "But if you have it, it's going to make you quite sick." For the next few days, my family watched me carefully. Richard, of course, took pleasure in making me feel like I was quarantined. He held a cloth over his mouth and nose every time he came near me. Then he'd hack and gag, mimicking the dreadful cough of the fever. As the days passed, it was evident that I was not going to get sick. But more and more reports came to us from neighbors who were falling ill. Even the Everests and the Gavlots and the Tundervolds and the Moleskis. It was an epidemic. We were all worried about our friends, but Babushka was determined that our Festival of Lights was going to go on as planned. On the afternoon before Hanukkah, she bustled into her kitchen. "Such latkes I'll make for you this year," she exclaimed, while digging through the choicest potatoes in the bin. She hummed happily as she placed the potatoes in front of me. I shredded them with great care. "They have to be just right for my latkes." Mama and Babushka dressed down 2 chickens for roasting and put them in the oven. Our kitchen was bustling. Oh dear, just telling you this story, I can smell what that kitchen smelled like. It smelled kind of like apples and cinnamon and frying chicken. Oh, it was beautiful. Just as the aroma of the wonderful feast met our nostrils, the sun set, and it was time to light the menorah. Grandpa recited the blessings and lit the shamas, the candle used to light all the others. Babushka put the first candle in the menorah and lit it with the shamas. Then Mama told the story, as she did every year, of our people long ago. "Tonight we are celebrating miracles," she started. "That miracle that a very small band of Jewish farmers turned soldiers could defeat a huge Syrian army." Interesting. And we're fighting Syria even today. This is interesting. "Well, they were really farmers before they were soldiers," Richard asked. "Yes, they were," Grandpa said, "just like us. They were fighting so that they could worship in their own way," my mother added. "Then there was the miracle of the light," my grandfather said with a twinkle in his eye. "One tiny drop of oil burned in the temple for 8 whole days. Such a miracle," my babushka exclaimed. "Miracles can happen even today," Grandpa said quietly. After dinner, Grandpa handed us the first of our beautifully wrapped presents. He looked troubled, though. "You know," he began, "our neighbors are having such a hard time, and this should be a time of gladness for them. If only we could do something to make their holiday special." And then his voice trailed off. Babushka thought for a while. They always bring a tree into their house. Only in America does a tree grow right out of the living room floor. She rocked with laughter. Carly, we should cut down trees and take them to their houses, Papa announced. Babushka smiled in agreement. I'll cut them tonight. You can help, Richard, Grandpa said, already pulling on his winter coat. We can dress down more chickens and take them food, Babushka said as she scurried into the kitchen. Mama and I can decorate the trees, I shouted excitedly. But this is not our custom. We have nothing to decorate the trees with, my grandmother said. What about the carvings, my mother said softly. They both looked at me. What do you think? They have no way of making their children happy this year. At first I was a little disappointed, but then as I thought about it, I knew it was the right thing to do. Our neighbors needed cheering, and we were just about the only ones in our county that didn't have this terrible fever. Grandpa and Richard brought the cut trees into the living room. They nailed boards onto the bottom of each one so they could stand up. They were very small trees. Grandpa had only taken the tops off from our evergreens, but they were beautiful. And when they were all standing in the living room, it looked like a forest, like the woods just outside of Kiev when I was a little girl, Babushka said breathlessly. Grandpa started hanging some of his wooden animals on the branches of a tree. A dancing goat, my Babushka remarked as she looked closely at one of them. We shall call these the trees of the dancing goats, and make sure to hang a dancing goat on each tree. As we decorated the trees, we sang and laughed. The single candle in the menorah flickered as we rushed past it to reach another carved animal or to paste together paper chains to hang on the trees. We worked all night. Then Grandpa, Richard, and I finished the decorating. Babushka and Mama roasted more chickens and fried more potato latkes. They packed the food in the baskets, and each one Babushka put one of her homemade Hanukkah candles, so they will have the light of God in their hearts, and so that God will protect them and make them well again, she murmured. We loaded Grandpa's old Ford with the trees and the food baskets and sent Babushka and Grandpa into the early light of dawn with their Christmas cheer. Just like Santa, my brother said. Mr. and Mrs. Santa, I added. We waited eagerly for their return later that morning. We thrilled when Babushka and Grandpa told of how they entered the home of each neighbor, set up a tree in the living room, put the baskets of food on the table, and then put a candle in a holder for them to light later. Mama was a little worried that they'd been exposed to the fever, but Babushka said, "And so much worse I've been, you shouldn't know from. God will protect. God will protect us. This I know." A week later, the 8 days of Hanukkah had come and gone, and we sat down for our last feast. There was a knock at the door. "Who could that be?" Babushka said as she scurried to the door with her usual warm smile. It was the Criminalists, Cherry and her mom and dad. They looked pale, but assured us they were quite well now. "We have something for you," Cherry announced as she bolted through the door holding a basket. Her mother and father had tears in their eyes as they hugged my grandparents and my mother. "Look at what my dad made for you," Cherry said as she pulled out a menorah that Mr. Crimmel had carved out of wood. On it, he had mounted some of the animals that we had given to them. "How beautiful," my Babushka said as she placed it on our table. "Come, sit," Grandpa invited them. "You are so welcome. Thank you. Thank you, George," Mr. Crimmel said, looking into my grandfather's eyes. They sat down and shared our feast. By the time our menorah had been lit for an hour or so, and when we lit the candles on the new menorah, we noticed something wondrous. Look, I called out. Our old candles are exactly as tall as the new ones. The old ones don't even look burned down, Mama said softly. Another miracle, Grandpa said. A miracle indeed, my babushka said, giving me a big hug. Then we all got up and danced and laughed together in the flickering candlelight. Our neighbors all recovered from that terrible fever. Few were left with any permanent damage. What they were left with was a long cherished memory of the Christmas when Santa really did come. And my family, too, has never forgotten that incredible winter of the fever, the miracle of true friendship, and the trees of the dancing goats. And we now are almost reliving the same crisis. And perhaps this would be a time, and it certainly has become in many cities in our country, where young people have put together baskets of food and medical supplies and taken them especially to the elderly who can't leave their homes. This has given us an opportunity, as it did then, to show neighbors how much they are cared for. And yes, this crisis is terrible. We don't know when it's going to end, but it gives us the opportunity, don't you see, to be kind and to care about others as much as we care for ourselves. And by the time this crisis is over, that I think is the most important lesson we as a species are going to learn, to care about your neighbors as much as you do yourself. A miracle indeed. Thank you.